Good afternoon, everyone. So we're going to take the high picture of things today. We've been dealing with cybersecurity issues and vulnerabilities for about 30 years, maybe more. If we go back to 1988, we're almost coming up on the 30th year anniversary of the Morris worm. And, we see sort of the ransomware attack, the recent WannaCry attack. The Morris worm is sort of the progenitor of that. And we're also seeing a lot of old school attacks coming back, the macro attacks that struck the Ukraine power grid, and ransomware itself, which dates circa around 2005 when it began. So we're looking at a lot of issues that we haven't really resolved. We've had some Band-Aid solutions, and those have bought us some time, but things like Heartbleed and the SS7 hijackings that are going on, things like this are indicators that we've run out of time with the Band-Aids, and we need to take a broader look at global solutions that get at the core infrastructure problems, and as well as the larger issues in general, not just the tech issues. Our two speakers today are going to address these issues. First of all, we've got Jay Healy. To my right here is Senior Research Scholar at Columbia University School for International Public Affairs. And Jay is going to talk about a New York task force that he was a part of that looked at these bigger issues and some of the solutions that they've come up with. And after him will be Jan Neutze, Director of Cybersecurity Policy at Microsoft for Europe, Middle East, and Africa. And so our format here is going to be, Jay will speak first for about 20 minutes, and then we'll do about 25 minutes of Q&A. I'll ask some questions, but I want you guys to as well. And then we'll go over to Jan he'll do a 20-minute presentation, and then we'll again follow that with about 25 minutes of Q&A. Is okay?
Great. Good afternoon, everyone. I am so freaking tired. I don't even know how I'm standing. So thanks for joining. So I'm going to talk about this New York Cyber Task Force. We are in the final stages of the draft. Actually, I was just working on that out at the tables, intaking caffeine, and so this is the final draft before we're going to come out with it in the next coming weeks. And it really fits in with a lot of what you already heard this morning, especially from Paul Nicholas and Ralph Langner. And so I'll be referencing back to some of their points. We hadn't coordinated this. It just kind of worked out that way, that our thinking is going down the same path. And really where we were coming from, this is my paraphrasing of the New York Cyber Task Force. I'm not sure they would essentially have signed off on this wording if they knew I were using it. But that we have been behind as defenders for decades. Actually, since the 70s, I've found quotes that have said that the attackers will always get through. And so just like Ralph said in his talk earlier today, we can do better at defense. We don't necessarily need a Cyber Manhattan Project or a Cyber Moonshot if we are just doing some things better and we're doing it according to the right strategy. We can make significant gains. And so what we're going to come through is my message is that there's been no central strategy behind information security for the past decades. And you need that strategy or that policy framework, thanks Joanna, so that we can do critical things. If you don't have that strategy, you can't measure yourself, you can't prioritize, especially when you've got competing public goods. Now, the best strategies are just a couple of words. Right? What's the most successful national security strategy we ever had? Containment. A single word. And in the US, we might have disagreed between how to go about containment. We might have disagreed on the tactics of it. But everyone agreed on the same strategy. So what the New York Cyber Task Force has been doing is saying, well, let's take the idea of a more defensible cyberspace. And let's take that as that central strategy. So how can we make our own enterprise more defensible? How can we make our sector more defensible, our nation's cyberspace as a whole? And so as we'll talk about, defensible is solutions that have that advantage the defense and that scale most easily. So as I mentioned, we've had these quotes back from 1979 that talks about how the attacker will always get through. And so we framed that of saying, look, attack is easier than defense because of the asymmetry of the offense. And people like John Mallory and others have done good work on this about how scale aids the attacker more than it does the defender. If they put in an hour, if they put in $1, they get way more for that dollar than we do as defenders. Now, you've got, as every information security person has their favorite reasons why that's true. I'm not going to go through this list. I hope your favorite reason is on there. Internet architecture wasn't designed to be secure. Software weaknesses, we've got to patch everything. They only have to be right once. And on through the entire list of complexity, sentient opponents. We can't just build it. We have to continue to do it over time. But we've got, it really struck me when we were doing this list, because we just keep adding these reasons of why the attacker has the advantage. And so we can try and keep adding in incremental solutions all the time to fix this, but then that just aids the complexity and doesn't necessarily get us any farther. So we formed this New York Cyber Task Force. It's only New York in the fact that most of us are located there. Officially, our university is Columbia University in the city of New York, and so we tried to get together with media CISOs, the bank CISOs, other academics, some people up from Washington, D.C., like Angela McKay, to try and take on these main questions. What would a more defensible cyberspace look like? Why hasn't it been defensible to date? We just talked about that part. What are the past innovations that we've done that have made the most difference, and what made them important? And then what lessons can we take from those innovations, and what does that inform us about what we ought to do next? So really quickly, defensible just meant defense advantage. What can we do that is it even thinkable to talk about a cyberspace where the defender has the advantage? We have the high ground. And so it has to have, an internet would have to have these kinds of characteristics. What we really thought was the main part, was really the main part to me, is what are the innovations, the interventions that we've done in the past that has made the biggest difference? And I really came across this because it was about maybe almost 3 years ago. The Economist ran an article on climate change. And they said, well, what interventions have we done that have taken the most carbon dioxide equivalent out of the environment? And top one was the Montreal Protocol. And many of you might not have even heard of that. That was the CFCs. And it wasn't even meant to be about climate change specifically. It was meant to be about the ozone layer. And you can see it was as effective as almost everything else combined, and it was far cheaper. And they said, well, one, as far as we can tell, almost no one has ever asked the question this way. What have we done that's made the biggest difference? And I was reading, thinking, well, what have we as cyber defenders done that has made the biggest difference? And as far as I could tell, we'd never really asked the question that way before. So we jumped in and we said, all right, the solutions that we're looking for are going to have these two characteristics. Has to be defense advantage. So to be an important innovation, it has to cost us less to implement it than it takes the bad guys to take it down. And better yet, if it can do that at scale. If we can make the scale of the internet help us more than it helps the defenders. So if you're doing this innovation, can it scale across all of the internet, all of cyberspace, pretty much automatically? So I'm just gonna we'll provide these slides. The report's going to be out. I'm not going to read all of them, but what we did was we said some of these innovations are technology, and some are within the enterprise. Those are the ones that we know best and that we're most familiar with: firewalls, passwords, intrusion detection systems. But we've also got technological innovations that have worked across cyberspace as a whole. Windows Update. When we went out and talked to cyber experts, professionals in the business, when we said what innovations have made the most difference, Windows Update was one of those that just kept coming up. Yeah, Jan is doing a little But these automated update is one of these technological innovations that helped across cyberspace as a whole because it gave scale to defenders. But we also looked at operational and policy innovations because we too frequently forget these. Right? We had to invent an organization called a Computer Emergency Response Team. We had to invent a role called CISO in 1995. And Kim brought up Morris worm, right? We had, after the Morris worm, we said, man, we need something like a CERT. And so a lot of times we don't think about those organizational innovations. Some of those organizational innovations helped across cyberspace as a whole, like NANOG, that has gotten mentioned a couple of times today, the operator group, the threat alliances, even just the rise of the security industry itself. And we also had the policy innovations. Now, as we get farther to the right, as we get to the policy innovations, it's tougher to judge whether it's been really important or not. Because generally when as you get farther to the right, you've got winners and losers, and it's a little tougher to figure out how to measure it, whether they're real wins. But some certainly, like information sharing, right? That started with a presidential directive in the US in 1998. That then led to the organizational innovation of creating information sharing and analysis centers. That then led to automated threat sharing and indicators that then led to technical innovations within the enterprise. For policy, we also include, for example, the Budapest Convention and other areas like that have affected across cyberspace as a whole. So, and these will be out in our report shortly. So we said, boy, some of these innovations worked in these different ways. Some of them were hardening an asset. Some were helping organizational and management structure. Others were tied to education or situational awareness. And we have all of these assigned, and you'll see when the report comes out. Now, the strategy isn't just do more of the good stuff. It's also start de-investing in the not so good stuff. And we had some of those that certainly came up. Policy, the Wassenaar agreement. We had a lot of, one of the cybersecurity companies said before Wassenaar they needed 10 export licenses. With Wassenaar, they stopped counting at around 1,000 and how many they might need. How was originally expected. Check-the-box compliance solutions got brought up by pretty much everyone as operational innovations that had largely lived past. And then technologists had innovations past their expiration date, because it really struck us as we were going through and looking for the important innovations of seeing this curve. We call it from essential to albatross in the report, where the innovations start being amazing and you've got to use these, like passwords, right? Passwords were absolutely critical when they came out, fundamental to computer security when they came out, until a few years ago when everyone at CyCon and RSA and Black Hat and, oh my God, passwords, why are we still using passwords, right? But now with two-factor authentication, right? I mean, now with other means, they've bounced back a bit. And so we've got to recognize where we are on this chart when it comes to the innovations. And we don't want to lock in the innovations with regulation or legislation so that we're stuck with an expired innovation that we can't then roll out and re-engineer or re-up. So what are the lessons from that? So we found these were the three main lessons that we took away from this. That the best innovations scale is massively in the favor of the defense. And that can happen in a couple ways, and you can see some of the ways that the people that we talked to here. These four, those responsible make a change, take the user out of the solution, take away an entire class of attacks. Those overlap quite a bit. It's just a different way of thinking about the problem. The second one is uses the least intervention necessary. This is a similar point to the first one, but is a little bit easier formulation to think about policy and operational issues. And one of the ways we mean by tried and true governance structures or solutions is if we regulate for transparency rather than regulating for security, for example, transparency solutions can help align the market incentives and in ways that if you regulate for security, you might or may not get the result that you want. Transparency as a first step might be better. And lastly, operational policy innovations are powerful but often overlooked. Technologists tend not to understand the operational and policy tools or underestimate them, whereas the policy folks sometimes don't understand the full implications of what they're proposing. Okay. We had a few things that came out, and we called them curveballs, where we're not really sure which direction they're going to go. This morning, Ralph talked about security automation, and he showed the supercomputers. But Paul Nicholas brought this up. It's too early to tell whether bringing in automation is going to help the offense more than the defense. I personally am more worried that the attackers with the supercomputers are going to do better than the defenders with the supercomputers. That it's more likely that automation, on balance, is going to aid the attackers. But we'll have to wait and see. It's certainly one of those that we couldn't say, yep, automation, supercomputers are going to solve the problem, because they might not. They might make it worse on balance. So we looked at what are some of the important upcoming defensive innovations, and I'll leave that up there for the folks that are taking the photos. But again, the report should be out not too long. Oh, and this summarizes what some of those innovations we're going to be doing. So within technology, we brought these up. I was shocked when I went into this. To me, I was still on the fence about cloud technologies and whether they were going to overall help security. And I was just really surprised and impressed at how much the technologists around the table were pushing and saying, no, we haven't even begun to see the real gains that we're going to get from cloud. You know, Steve Bellovin, Phil Venables, Ed Amoroso, all saying, no, you ain't seen nothing yet when it comes to the cloud. Obviously, some of the others migrating from passwords, more secure code. It surprised me a little bit as we're going through this to see the return of formal methods. You know, something that I learned, and it was only really for the laboratory, but is really coming out. What DARPA has been doing, what Microsoft has been doing, for example, to use inexpensive formal methods to write new HTTPS. So that way you've got a far more secure internet standards. Quantum encryption. And then we looked at some of these operational and policy issues as well. These, again, summarize some of those innovations that were on the previous slide. I'm adding, so these are the ones that we thought were a little bit easier, that people have come out with. I don't think we have any brand new ideas here, per se, but these were the innovations that we thought most were matching what we could do at scale. We came out with some innovations that that certainly work at scale, but when you're getting into these, you have to decide who pays. And who pays and who's going to suffer is a much more difficult decision on this slide than it is on the earlier ones. You know, for example, using defensive worms to go and patch systems. Like make sure we don't have another Mirai by writing a counter Mirai that's going to go around and patch those systems. That certainly works at scale. It's certainly inexpensive. It's far easier than trying to convince everybody to patch their systems, but obviously it has a lot of downsides if it's not done well. And we think all of these have those. So the task force didn't have agreement on these, but we did say, well, these, we don't have consensus, but at least these are important. That certainly fit leverage as we've been talking about it, but we couldn't talk, that we weren't going to recommend ourselves. So the recommendations that we have, we've got some for US government and the EU, as well as recommendations for technology and cybersecurity companies, as well as organizations dependent on technology. And again, I don't think there's anything that you haven't seen on other slides at 30 other conferences. But hopefully by trying to be rigorous about how we're getting to this, I think we've got a lot more confidence in our answers than we have when we've made similar recommendations in the past. So just to close, here is our story. So we think the internet can be more defensible. Defense is possible. We can do better, but we've got to recognize what's working and what isn't. Continuing to go, all right, we've got 1,000 tools. If we've got 1,001 tools out there, we're really going to make a difference. That's not helping. We've been in the same situation for decades. Again, that quote from 1979 that the attackers always get through. So that means everything we've done since 1979, the tens of billions of dollars we've spent, the missed birthdays, the missed weekends, all of the patents that have been issued have been at best to break even. Sometimes I don't even know why people listen to us anymore. Like, it's been decades and we haven't fixed this yet. So we think we need to start looking at some of these tougher solutions. We need to have the right strategy of where are we going to get the most leverage and putting the bulk of our investment into those investments. I like how Paul Nicholas said it earlier in talking about tipping points. The bad guys have had the advantage for decades. So how long can a system stay in equilibrium where the attackers have the advantage year after year, decade after decade? How long can you still keep that in balance? Right now, the attacker has the advantage. Maybe if we don't do things right, the attacker is going to have supremacy. And then instead of the internet being a global human right, it becomes a luxury good. So we think we need to start doing changes now. We think those changes are reasonable if we choose the right strategy. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much for that, Jay. I'm always surprised, actually, when security experts actually are recommending the cloud. I've just been, I don't see the point in that, because if you're putting all the data in one place, it obviously makes it, the targets much more reduced. But, so I wanted to ask you just briefly, you talked about some of the successes and the solutions that operated at a wide scale and also cost the attackers. Are there specific ones that were just outright losers that you thought were hands down things that we never should have done, or?
I get a good quote from a colleague that runs a poll between security professionals every month, and he found that we are up to 52% of security professionals and organizations have buyer's remorse. So more than half of the time, when someone buys a new tool, when a CISO buys a new tool, like, oh man, damn it, why did I buy that, right? And so that really struck me that this is so high. So I don't think it's anyone, especially on the technological side, like any that was a bad technology that got us there. But I think it's the collection of technologies that themselves, it's this incrementalism of all I need is these additional tools. I now see this new attack X, I now need an anti-X tool. Right. Rather than the more generalized solutions. And I think it'll be very interesting to see if we can get the venture capital and the R&D community to start to putting more investment in these root solutions rather than, hey, I've got a new security company that has a new widget. This widget's going to sell really well, and we chase after that.
So those larger solutions, this isn't a question about individual products, but it's about, you talked about the solutions that did succeed in terms of being wide scale and costing attackers, passwords, firewalls, Windows Update. All of those things are geared toward the end user, though, and the client side. And they don't really get at the core infrastructure problems that we're facing, that we've seen with Heartbleed, that we see with SS7, that we see with BGP routing hijacking, things like that. Those 20-year-old code problems in open source software that no one ever bothered to look at. So what is the solution there? I mean, who should take leadership over addressing those kinds of solutions, and really, how should we go about it?
Well, what I really liked after Heartbleed was when you saw the big cybersecurity companies, the platform companies, and others, and starting to jump in and say, you know what, we're critically dependent on some of these small bits of technology that we're all using that are open source and don't have a lot, and they were steering funding into those. That's not the absolute solution. I would love to start seeing on top of that DHS grants that are matching that, of saying, let's come out, it was my number one recommendation for this administration. We go back and we look at how, when we've had major cyber incidents, Conficker, Heartbleed, counter APT, denial of service attacks, who actually did what to solve the problem? And that we go through in a disciplined way to figure out what organizations, what people took what actions, made what decisions based on what information, what happened then. And we then use that to steer the next National Cyber Incident Response Plan. We then step in and say, all right, what information could they have used? And that's where we try and steer DHS. Are there some organizations in there, like the OpenSSH, that are trying to do too much with too little, and we try and steer DHS grants and other money towards them?
So not having government take a leadership role in that, but just a funding role, since the real knowledge is actually in the tech community.
Correct. Now, that doesn't fully solve the problem that you just talked about, but I was just trying to stall until Jan goes.
John, do you want to weigh in on that question?
I mean, so I think generally I would agree with everything, which is on everything Jay said. I would probably just add, from our perspective, we actually do believe that the cloud actually is a net positive for security, and I think actually there's great security innovation that happens through cloud computing. There are hundreds of new cloud security features that come out in our cloud service every year alone. There is you get sort of the scale effect of security. You talked about hyperscale in your presentation, and I think when we're able to mitigate against threats against a particular customer or group of customers, those learnings and those benefits then actually benefit everyone using that service. And I think that's the kind of scale effect that you're really getting in a cloud environment that you wouldn't necessarily get in the traditional on-prem environment. So I think there is a lot more there that we probably need to all do a better job of explaining some of those benefits. But.
And also to answer your question on what do we do about the legacy base, it really strikes me in one of the things that Paul Nicholas talked about earlier in the need for new organizations. He was bringing it up for the attribution organization, but it strikes me that you could say, all right, do we have can we go through and say, all right, what are all of these individual pieces that we're most critical on? Where are these? What are the organizations that are supporting this? And start building new organizations to support them. And I don't think that's, we can do a better job at that. What I talked about was a little bit more ad hoc of how we can start, for example, steering grants to them. But we might look at a new, oh my God, I'm going to say it, public-private sector partnership. I never say that word.
I think you would say info sharing now.
And, but you could imagine some new hybrid organization that's going to say, all right, let's look at where all the legacy code that we're most dependent on, these legacy standards, and how are we going to step up to try and do that? And you can imagine DHS S&T in that. You can imagine the platform companies involved in that, some of the cybersecurity companies.
So you talked about Windows Update being sort of this game changer, but again, it was a game changer for individual users, and it doesn't really get at sort of the enterprise problem that we have, where patching doesn't happen automatically. And in particular, if we're talking about critical infrastructure, industrial control systems, right, patching might happen once a year, even maybe not even that often. How do we solve this problem? And WannaCry was a kind of, I don't want to say wake-up call, but it was a reminder that waiting just even 2 months to install a patch that was available, it can be detrimental to an organization. How do we solve that enterprise patching problem? How do we make it go faster, less painful for enterprises?
A lot of it comes down to the governance structure within the organization itself. And what I mean by that, I've seen, for example, banks that said, well, you know what, we're going to keep running this Windows XP because we're still making millions of dollars on it. It's running this old code, but it's this great app and we don't want to rewrite it. And the CISO says, okay, great, you've got a waiver, no big deal, because the business has oomph. If the organization has the right structure, there's a governance committee, right? It goes to the board. You need a waiver. You say, all right, you're going to run obsolete software. You make $2 million from it. That's at the end a risk that's going to go to the shareholders for a publicly traded company, right? The the board of directors is there to represent the shareholders and make sure the company is making the right risk decisions. So after we have things like WannaCry, where those decisions now impact the entire organization, right? Companies, especially publicly traded companies, need a better process so that when one part of the firm is holding the others at risk, that you've got a process to go through for obsolete software. And that fits its way through patching too, right? I'd been with Goldman Sachs a couple of times, and it used to be that we would fully test the patches before we pushed them out. Our patch cycle was 30 to 45 days. And then one day, the CISO, Phil Venables, just said, no, we're patching it out to everyone. And if you fail, and if the product fails, it fails in the development environment, and then you roll it back. You roll it out you test it. You roll it out in the development environment. If it fails, you roll it back. And we didn't get affected by worms anymore. They stopped. And because we rolled it out with the presumption it was going to work, and then only if it failed in development would those folks then use the old version. And to me, those kinds of governance models, those kinds of operational processes, I think they can work.
You talk about, I don't know if you mentioned it here, but in your report, you talked about how the task force didn't agree on or shied away from imposing responsibility or liability on software makers and device makers as well. What was the reason for that? Was that just because it would be too hard to determine who's liable for vulnerable software? And I want to say the caveat was not just any software, but software that has known vulnerabilities and that they've simply refused to patch. And I'm not sure that everyone would agree if that's a wise caveat or if it actually should be broader. Yeah. But what was the reason for why everyone was opposed to that?
Honestly, I didn't even try to push. As executive director, I wasn't even trying to push it because I thought it would take, we meet usually for an hour and a half at a time, and I thought that would take us 6 meetings to get through for example, is that more important than ISPs not passing the trash? Is that more important than some of the other, than active defense? And when it came down to it, I thought getting the consensus among 30 members, we were never going to get all the way to consensus on that. And so we focused on, well, what are the things that we really do definitely agree on? We did agree in these areas of greater transparency. So software bill of materials, for example, so that way you know what's in the code that you're getting. The things that Mudge and Sarah Zatko were doing with the cyber independent testing labs, consumer reports.
The nutrition labels for software.
Right, the nutrition labels for software. Consumer reports is now starting to add cyber vulnerability, cyber risk in their consumer reports reviews. So these are all things that I think can help and are an important step that comes before I think we need to get to liability.
So I'm going to open up to questions in just a minute, so get prepared. But I just wanted to ask one other question with regard to government role in defense of large enterprises. Something interesting came up in the Sony hack. After Sony was hacked and the government attributed that to North Korea, the reason for why the government said that it could do that attribution was because it was so deeply embedded, or this is what was reported, was that it was so deeply embedded in the North Korean systems that it could actually see the negotiations going on around the attack or even post the attack. And so the logical question that came up with then was, well, if the government is in these systems, why couldn't it have anticipated the attack and warned Sony? So regardless of whether or not the case existed in that particular circumstance for them to have that ability, should the government be in that business? Because let's say, particularly the US government, but there are other governments that also have that ability to see a wider view of the network. Should the governments be in the job of warning and anticipating attacks and maybe even thwarting them with the hackback or some of the other kinds of active defense techniques? Yeah,
the way I usually approach this is in cyber conflict, the private sector is the supported command, not the supporting command. And for a while, the US government had the view of, well, what's the private sector going to do to help the US government solve the problem? And that generally has it completely reversed. It's almost always the private sector that's actually fixing the problem. And so wherever possible, the government, for the most part, has to help the private sector. The private sector has subject matter expertise, they have agility, and they have the ability to change the physics of cyberspace. Mark Sachs used to say, he worked for Verizon, look, we can bend cyberspace if we need to. The government can't do any of that well. Any government. But what the government has, it's got access, it's got far more massive resources, at least the US. That gives it incredible staying power, and it has access to other levers of power. Can arrest people if we need to, we can stab people if we have to. And so the best mix is going to be bringing both of these together. So I think there can be a role in that, for the US government in that, but it's going to be a relatively high threshold. Maybe not an attack on Sony, but maybe an attack on electrical sector. And so I think it's going to be an interesting balance as we work through what that best relationship is to get those strengths from the private sector as well as the strengths of the public sector.
Questions in the audience? Oh, go ahead. That one. And then here.
Hi, I'm George, a student at Glasgow University. My question is, you mentioned the worm that can actually force it patch the computers that are not patched already. So is it bringing more harm than it benefits?
Right.
And the second question is about role of insurance companies, which can basically raise the fees for not being timely updated. What do you think about that? Thank you.
Great, thank you. Yeah, on the worm, the best example out was the Welchia worm, which was 2003, the age of the great worms, when all the worms were hitting companies, and Blaster had just come out. And it affected many of our organizations here. And someone wrote Welchia to go in, and it would infect computers. It would download the patch from Microsoft that would not let Blaster in, and if Blaster was there, it would try and delete it. So of course, that is not something that has taken off as a great idea. It's generally seen as a dumb idea, I think, in the community because of the chance that it's going to do a lot more damage, right? If we're worried about patching with a legitimate patch, then what's an illegitimate patch going to do? But it certainly does have scale. The idea is starting to come back. It's being called a do-gooder or an ethical worm. And I felt like we needed to at least include it, especially since we just come through WannaCry. Insurance is the darling of Washington, D.C. and other capitals right now, because this is the way that we've handled so many of other similar problems like this. I think it's still going to be a while because we don't have a good enough understanding of the risk in enough cases, right? How many of the cyber risks we're facing are like life insurance, where you can have a good actuarial set of what's going to happen because you've got a nice range, what's going to happen, versus how much of it is fire insurance or hurricane insurance or flood insurance, where you might not see anything for a couple of years and then you get a massive hit because you've had a large-scale outage. So that's why I like pushing the transparency. I think the risk metrics and things like that can help align those market forces, SEC guidance, things like that, for more mandatory reporting, so that way we can get a better sense of what's happening, and that I think helps align the markets in ways that will make the insurance more effective. Right now, I think we're maybe only $10 billion in premiums written right now, and that's very, very tiny. I think it's going to be a long way still.
Hello, Olaf Kolkman, Internet Society.
Oh.
Just as a follow-up to the botnet that's going around, a breaker bot that fixes Mirai vulnerabilities by just breaking the devices. Yeah. You can have all kinds of question marks with that. But my question was actually more around, I think it's a clarifying question. The way that I look at your presentation, without having the benefit of having seen the report, I'm really looking forward to it, is I think that all solutions with respect to cybersecurity come from evolution. So I've been looking at your list through that lens, and my feeling is, by looking at it, perhaps with the exception of quantum cryptography, quantum computing, that there are no paradigm shifts or very profound shifts in the things that we can do. The industry is already moving to the cloud. fundamental methods of code security have been looked at in academia for years and years and years, and they're getting better. People are funding software libraries, and I'm not.
Yeah.
I'm not disagreeing that taking a strategic position here is a bad thing, but I was wondering about, is there a paradigm shift that you see?
On the technological side, I would certainly think that the initial thinking of the cloud itself was, right? I mean, yeah, now that we're in midstream, it doesn't seem like it was very big, but I mean, it really has been a big change. I think if there's somewhere that I might say where you're seeing the paradigms, especially because to me paradigms is about a mindset, right? And so take Intel-driven operations and the cyber kill chain, right? Those had a significant difference. I mean, especially the kill chain, right? That's just an idea of a way to think about stopping the adversary, of what the adversary has to do to get into your system. And just, you think about it and you say, good, now what do I do different to try and do that? And boy, if that's not a clear paradigm in itself, it's a doctrine, it's a thought, and it's changed the business. And that really was one of my favorite examples of an operational innovation that's free. I mean, it's low cost, and yet can fundamentally change the way that we think about defensive operations. And yet time and time again, we don't think about operational innovation. We don't think about process innovation. We jump into what's our new technology that we have to buy.
Any more questions?
Hi, I'm Matthias Schulze from the German Institute for International and Security Affairs. Thanks for the presentation, really nice handiwork collecting the arguments, and I'm really looking forward to the report. What struck me, and you probably thought about that in the group, what about the economy here? I mean, most of the problems, patch cycles, malware as a service, etc., these are not tech problems, these are economic problems, because there's a lot of bang for the buck producing black hat software, so to speak. So shouldn't we think about this issue from an economic perspective, like, for example, we look at the global drug market, which is a big market and a big problem and is probably not going away, but the problem started with the increased war on drugs in the 70s, right? So maybe there's a parallel here that our way of fighting the problem increases incentives and financial gain for the bad guys. So maybe we should need to think about economic solutions for that.
Yeah, and I think you're right on that, and we can. A bunch of things are running through my head because as we're talking about this idea, I mean, it is kind of obvious when you think about it, right? That we should do the things that have the biggest impact, right? I mean, when phrased like that, people are like, "Oh, okay." And some would say, "Well, what you mean is ROI," and I'm like, "Well, no, we don't mean ROI necessarily because." That's only thinking about the defensive side. And others said, well, you mean imposing costs on the bad guy, especially the military folks. Well, no, we don't just mean imposing costs, because we've got to think about our own costs as well. And so you're right, it is in this full mix. There's no doubt there's plenty of people in the business. There's no HR problem. The market is working absolutely fantastically, and there's plenty of innovation. It's just that too much of those things are aiding the bad guys more than it's aiding us. One reason why we couldn't agree, and this is one of Kim's questions, on some of those harder choices, was that it's not just who pays at the end of the day; it's the hit to innovation. I mean, if we're looking at stricter liability, Microsoft is probably going to be able to get through that because they've got great lawyers. The smaller companies and the startups aren't going to be able to. So we know it's going to have this differential impact on innovation that we just haven't thought through yet. And so I think about, in getting to the paradigm question from Olaf earlier, how might we disrupt their economics? You know, if we know there are ASs or there are other bits of infrastructure that seem to be predominantly used for criminal purposes, what can we do about that? I've even tried to think about, all right, instead of regulating ISPs to say you can't pass trash, let's have a cap and trade system, right? You can pollute this much, and if you're a crappier network than this, then you've got to buy credits from someone else, or you get taxed above that level. maybe that's a stupid idea, but it starts to change the way that we think about this into not just regulating for security, but trying to find some of these other ways to do it. And I love what we do for the drug war, where we're saying, let's not make it illegal, let's focus on the harm that it causes, and let's try and treat it as a public health issue for the harm. That's an interesting set of ideas might come from that. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Jay. Let's move on to Jan's presentation. And in terms of Microsoft's policy initiatives, they are released, all the three of those, right?
Yes.
Okay. So they have released 3 documents. One is on a digital Geneva Convention, one was on attribution, and the third one was on a
Global Tech Accord.
Global Tech Accord.
Great, thanks very much, Kim, and it's my great pleasure to be back at CyCon. I just tried to count earlier. I think this is my 5th or 6th in a row, and it's fascinating to see every year this conference is getting better, attracting just a great mix of people. So great to see so many of you here. I will try to build a little bit on what my colleague Paul Nicholas elaborated on or presented to you this morning, and maybe add some additional sort of thinking and concepts around what was discussed earlier in the day. I will actually try and skip through the presentation fairly quickly so we can leave some time for Q&A. And so among that, I think among this group, I don't need to go into the details around the economic impact caused by cyber attacks, but maybe just to point out that when we look at some of these numbers, and many of you have seen similar things, and there's many companies out there that have different ways of calculating some of these impacts. When we look at some of the estimated costs from cyber attacks, the projections between now and 2020 reaching up to $3 trillion, and this is, I think, in relation to lost productivity gain, those consequences are significant and they're severe. Other interesting data, of course, the median number of days between infiltration and detection. Many of us are looking at that as sort of an indicator. Are things getting better? Are we on the right trajectory? And we're still sort of, by most accounts, hovering around 140 plus days, and that's just simply still too long. And so I think the work that Jay and others are doing in that regard to kind of, let's try and focus on what are the things that really make a big difference and make a big impact are critical. What you'll see from what we're talking about, of course, is to layer on top of many of the technological innovations, we're fundamentally believing that we also need innovation in sort of our policy thinking and strategic approaches to cyber. And part of that, of course, involves government's roles in cyberspace. And I think many of you are very familiar with the ways that governments approach cyber, how government roles have changed and evolved over the years. I was here, I believe, last year to talk about that in more detail. But from our perspective, it is fascinating that we're seeing this sort of duality of governments both investing more in cyber operations, both offense and defense. And those numbers are estimates, they're not our numbers, those are sort of taken from news reports, what you see up there. At the same time, we're also seeing governments developing cyber legislation and strategies to actually move more into a regulatory framework around cybersecurity. Maybe not as much in the US yet, but certainly here in Europe, we've seen things like the Network Information Security Directive, which are very much taking the approach to try and address what many say is a market failure when it comes to security. And so I think we have both of those trends going on at the same time. I think we mentioned earlier that, I believe Paul mentioned it, but if he didn't, I'll repeat it. From a Microsoft perspective, we spend over $1 billion a year on cybersecurity. And we have over 3,500 engineers at the company working on cybersecurity. And I think that's a significant investment that is, I think, hard to rival. But when you look at some of these other investments that governments are making in this space, you start asking yourself, how much can we actually accomplish with $1 billion on defense? So from that, I think, then stem concerns around a number of alleged, in many cases, nation-state cyber attacks, and we'll get to the question of attribution. But there certainly is the sense that those alleged attacks that are getting more complex are contributing to this sort of feeling of rising cyber insecurity. We are almost to the date, 10 years after the 2007 attacks on Estonia, and when you look at what actually happened back then, the volume or the level of intensity, if you will, of those DDoS attacks actually pales in comparison to what is possible today. And I think when we take that and many other indicators for how attacks are getting more complex and more sophisticated and the tools that are being used, it is fairly clear that we do actually need to think about a paradigm shift here. And so what's the current state of play when it comes to those international debates? From our perspective, there are a number of existing international fora. There's a lot of intergovernmental discussion around cybersecurity and the use of ICTs for peace and security. Many of you would have followed the recent UN GGE discussions, the Government Group of Experts, which is concluding its work this time around again in June, in a couple of weeks' time. And the work that has been going on there also in the G7 and other groups, absolutely foundational, fundamental, I think, to starting down this path and continuing this path on getting to this paradigm shift, I think, that we're needing to see. But one of the challenges, I think, is that these discussions continue to be sort of taking place mostly between and among governments. There is a broadening that has taken place over the last few years, and we very much welcome that. But we also fundamentally believe that we need to get more actors involved in these international cyber policy and cyber norms discussions, not just global ICT providers such as Microsoft, and we have been trying to contribute to that discussion, but also many of the underlying infrastructures, the critical infrastructures, some of the sort of digital infrastructure, the telco providers, many of the assurance organizations. They all have important experiences that they need to share, and they need to be taking part in these discussions. Challenges there really is a limited number of public-private platforms where this is being discussed. We have with us, I think, in the room many of the commissioners of the newly established commission launched by the Dutch government for the stability of cyberspace, who will have a meeting later this week. And that, I think, is exactly the right approach to try and actually formulate ideas that can contribute to these processes. Other efforts, such as the London process, as it's known, the global conferences on cyberspace, have played an important role. There'll be another one of those later this year in India. And then, of course, you have some related efforts on capacity building in cyberspace that is now looking at not just advancing technological capacity building, but also working with countries to actually make a sort of difference in maturing some of the policy processes, which we think is important. But so where are we today from our perspective, and what is missing? We have a very robust discussion, I think a maturing discussion around existing legal frameworks and the sort of, broadly speaking, the applicability of international humanitarian law in cyberspace. There was a discussion earlier today here at the conference. We are, I think, in complete agreement with those that say, and I think there is a growing majority of states that believe that international law does apply to cyberspace, and that is foundational, I think, for everything we're trying to achieve in this space. The challenge is really sort of this threshold for where international law actually starts applying, and those are in situations of armed conflict. And many of the attacks I showed you earlier really still, from our perspective at least, would not necessarily have reached into that category of attacks. And so we continue to be in a situation where we do have a gray area, where you have activity taking place for which the rules simply aren't as clear. Now, let me be clear, the Tallinn Manual 2.0, and I will be the first to admit I have not read the whole document, and I show of hands who has read it all, cover to cover. Okay. 2. I just ordered my copy on Amazon. But I think the challenge is that the Tallinn Manual 2.0 has tried to make an important contribution in that regard, and we are seeing increased reference and discussions to that. It's a fairly new document, and the success of efforts like that will, of course, depend on how states will ultimately act in practice. It's about state practice, right? If we're trying to create customary international law, that is ultimately what really is a key component. And so what we have proposed, what our president, Brad Smith, came out at this point, I think 3 months ago, at the RSA conference in San Francisco, is he used this term that there was a need to create a digital Geneva Convention. And what we mean, or what he meant by that, was a set of peacetime rules and mechanisms to help protect civilians in cyberspace, again, in times of peace. And so what I wanted to briefly share with you, and I'm very happy to get into sort of questions around it, because I think there may have also been sort of I'm not sure if it's a set of misunderstandings or some questions around what we actually meant, but I just want to be very clear. This idea has 3 components, and these are the papers that you mentioned earlier, Kim. On the one hand, we have been calling on governments, and we've been doing that for some time now, to actually evolve and agree on a set of norms that over time could evolve into something that is legally binding, that would help protect civilians and civilian infrastructure below that threshold of armed conflict. The second piece is related to what industry should be doing, because it's very clear to us, not really sufficient to just be calling from an industry perspective on governments to do certain things, and so we are very sort of keen on trying to leverage some best practices, existing best practices, such as 0% offense, 100% defense, in particular among global sort of platform ICT providers. And then the third piece relates to the attribution effort, stemming from the belief that if you develop norms of behavior, if you even evolve it into international, customary international law or other sort of legally binding forms, you still need a mechanism to hold those that violate those norms accountable, or better accountable. And so I think Paul already talked to a degree about the attribution piece, and I'll save that for the end. But I just wanted to come back to this question of, well, what do you mean when you talk about norms? What are some of the things that from an industry or a Microsoft perspective are relevant to you? And so we've tried to sort of evolve this and group it into two groups essentially of norms. One, to say governments really shall not do things like impact or attack systems whose destruction would adversely impact safety and security of civilians, impact the global economy, insert backdoors into global mass ICT products, steal intellectual property of private companies. And I think we've actually seen some uptake of some of these things that in some cases we've been advocating for years in some of the more formal processes, be it the GGE or other governments coming out with statements that are somewhat similar. But then there's also, of course, sort of the more proactive side of things, or the sort of making sure that governments act in order to actually achieve something. And so I think this question of restraint in developing weapons and the restraint in proliferating weapons is something that's vital. And then sort of tied to that, a norm that we think is absolutely essential around how governments are making these equities decisions on when to stockpile vulnerabilities versus when to report them. And you mentioned WannaCry earlier. I think there are many lessons sort of in an example such as, or an incident such as WannaCry, and there are others, for where we would very much like to see not only a clear policy that's being followed with a bias to report vulnerabilities to vendors, but also more countries getting engaged in this discussion that to some degree we've seen in the US government has come out and sort of described its vulnerabilities equities process. We haven't seen anything similar really in Europe to date. And so, for societies that are digitizing as rapidly as they are, and for societies that want to maximize the benefits from that digitization, I think having some of these essential building blocks like a vulnerability reporting process and equities process in place, absolutely critical. Now, it turns out the EU is actually updating its cybersecurity strategy this year, and wouldn't it be a great idea to include some of these approaches in some of these important strategies? So those are some of the things that we've been advocating for. Very briefly, on the tech accord. As I mentioned, principles such as 0% offense, 100% defense, absolutely critical. But let's be clear, industry itself is not monolithic. There are companies out there whose sole business model and purpose it is to build cyber attack tools, and also fairly clear that those are not necessarily the ones we're going to be able to convince. But when we talk about sort of broad platform companies that have customers in many markets around the world, I think from our perspective, these are things that we should hopefully all try to be able to agree on. Another one is around assisting customers everywhere, sort of this idea of a globally neutral approach to things like patching. When we see two governments go to war on our platform or attacking each other on our platform, that's one customer attacking another customer, most probably. And so we are keen on making sure that we are actually sort of equitable in how we deliver those patches and aren't withholding those patches. I think the same is true for many other companies who aspire to be companies in markets around the world. Other efforts, and I won't run through all of them, but I think, again, sort of coordinating and working together to fight the proliferation of vulnerabilities is one thing that needs, from our perspective, to be transcending competitive boundaries. We're doing that today with some of our biggest competitors, where we do share certain information, indicators of compromise and other things. Groups like ICASI are really important in that context. I saw, Jay, you mentioned that in your study as well. Oftentimes little known, but there are efforts that exist in niches that I think we need to lift up and actually make sure that from a sort of principle perspective, we get large companies to come and agree to this. And so we're working very actively on this. In particular, I think from our perspective, it also seems on convincing governments. This is something that is not anything that will take a couple of months or even a couple of years. There are lots of challenges in that context, and we can talk about those. But on this, we're trying to make progress more rapidly, and we're trying to engage and are engaging with other companies on this notion of a need for a global tech accord. And then finally, this question around attribution. I think Paul did a fantastic job this morning outlining some of the work some of the thinking that we've had on this, but also some of the work that our colleagues from the RAND Corporation have been pulling together. And again, just as a reminder, their report around stateless attribution will be coming out, I believe, at the end of the week on Friday. But I want to be very clear on one thing, because we've been getting some feedback after this concept was announced and Brad's speech from some folks that have said, well, attribution, that's inherently a government function. What are you talking about? And so from our perspective, again, it's sort of really important to try and define what we mean and where all of us can kind of bring our respective, I think, strength to bear. There is, to date, a lot of technical data that resides in the private sector. If you have an email account with Outlook.com or Gmail or Yahoo, there may be times when you get notified from the vendor that you may have been the subject of a nation-state attempt to have your emails broken into. Now, those vendors will not tell you which nation-state, but it is a clear policy that most of the large email providers have adopted. We actually took our lead in doing so from Google on this. They were sort of the first ones to go down that route. And so it shows you some of the technical capabilities that do exist today. There is a lot of specialized knowledge. The challenge is that many of the research methodologies and how to go about this tend to be more sort of individualized, maybe. Different security vendors have different approaches. There's a whole different litany of terminology around this. And there's also no real sort of agreed upon set of confidence levels that would actually be sort of a trigger point for when one would say, okay, at this stage we feel like we have enough scientific evidence to have a clear understanding of who's responsible. And so not only does the RAND report, I think, or the RAND work in this do some really incredible work, but what we're hoping to achieve here is to actually, again, stimulate a much broader discussion on the fact that attribution has both a technical component that then might actually be able to further sort of enable a political discussion around attribution, which most certainly is a government function. We are not saying Microsoft or industry should be in the business of political attribution or the discussion of consequences. That is a government function. And so finally, I'll end on this, so we hopefully do have some time for questions. As we think about building out this organization, it's actually quite interesting. Again, I think Paul mentioned that the idea here might actually be to have this led by the private sector, maybe by other researchers, to come together and form such a group, not necessarily with formal government participation. And so I think that's just something to make very clear, that this is not trying to sort of rival government processes. At the same time, this group should have a narrow mandate. It should not have an enforcement mechanism. And there's others that have suggested other things. I know, Jay, you've actually done some work on this as well, and I think in your proposal you might have had you might have I think at the time called for some level of enforcement mechanism, and so there's different opinions there. There is a lot to think about when it comes to sort of confidence levels and thresholds, which again, both the report and I think the discussion that's moving forward on attribution, that's one of the critical elements. And then of course this organization does need to have a set of technical credibility and neutrality, and be sourced by technical experts from more than one country, from more than one geographic region, in order to have that sort of ability to be neutral. And then finally, there's an element about transparency. It should be something where the evidence is actually released to the public, so it doesn't happen in sort of a closed manner, which oftentimes today, when we look at least the political attribution that takes place, we've seen a lot more of that lately. But also, I think it's true that we have that sometimes those statements that are being made then are not able to sort of be backed up by some of the technical details very clearly for protection of sources and methods. And from a government perspective, that makes a lot of sense. But if you had an independent organization like that, I think there's a lot of merit in actually driving that forward. So those are the three pieces, and that kind of makes up in some what Brad at a high level kind of called this need for a digital Geneva Convention. I know that that term itself might give a bit of heartache to especially some of the international humanitarian law experts, but I just wanted to walk through that, and very interested and excited about your comments and your feedback. So thanks very much.
Great, thank you very much, Jan. So there's a lot of material to go on here because it is 3 reports about very different things. But one of the things that I wanted to address regarding your call for global technologies to commit to not trafficking in cyber vulnerabilities for offensive purposes. How realistic is this? Because governments and law enforcement agencies have legitimate needs for exploits and hacking tools. And you know, if we look at what happened with the Apple FBI case, where the FBI was asking Apple to undermine the security of its entire system in a way that would have opened Apple up to requests from other governments. And critics of that said there's got to be another way for the government to get into the system. And it turns out in the end that there was indeed. A third-party company sold an exploit to the FBI to get into this. So how do you balance that need, what you're saying about companies should not be involved in the offensive business? How do you balance that with the real needs, the genuine needs of government?
Right. So it's great question. I think this is why I try to sort of caveat this in a way to say industry is not monolithic, right? I think there are companies whose business model very much it is to develop tools to enable certain things, and I agree. It's hard to imagine that those companies would sign up to a global tech accord that said we will not hack into systems. We will only do defense. And it's at the same time also true that governments have multiple objectives and missions here, and there is a legitimate national security and law enforcement mission. And our approach has not to date been to say governments should never develop a cyber weapon. That's A, not realistic, and I think B is also, again, recognizing that governments have these different missions. It wouldn't be equitable. And so I think the question is, how can we, for those companies that have a large global market and user base, how can we ensure and enhance customer trust by those mass market commercial off-the-shelf providers that customers are continuing to be or willing to use those in a way that is that trustworthy and that enables them to use them with confidence. And so I think this is where we that's the target audience, if you will. And now, of course, if we can grow this group to a global set of providers that would sign up to these principles, I think that's all the better. But ultimately, I think we need to be realistic. We need to start. I think this is going to be sort of a crawl, walk, run. We need to start somewhere, and then hopefully be able to convince others down the line.
I thought it was interesting, you mentioned the vulnerability equities process that the U.S. has and that hasn't really expanded to the U.S., to Europe. And you've done a lot of work on the VEP process. And a lot of people would say it actually doesn't work, or it doesn't work as we would have hoped it had worked. I don't know, Jay, do you want to comment on?
Okay. Yeah, so we did a report at Columbia. It was largely researched by the students as part of a project that came out last November on the VEP. And I came out actually pretty sanguine about it. I mean, I came out and saying, boy, it's actually, we need a balance. This is a balance, and there's some improvements that we can make. The work by Rob Kanaki and Ari Schwartz I thought was particularly good in looking at the improvements. But it's really struck me in the time since that report's come out, to me, the strongest criticism isn't that things like the SMB vulnerability were kept. To me, the strongest, from my point of view, criticism has been from Dave Vitale and Matt Tate and others that say, look, there are so many vulnerabilities out there that having this big process that finds them and reports them one at a time essentially gives you so little security that it's not even worth the effort, because there's so many vulnerabilities out there. To me, that's led me to a larger issue with VEP, is that it's still a one vulnerability at a time process.
Do we need to define what the VEP process is? Does everyone know what it is?
It's the process. It used to be in the old days, the director of NSA could decide himself which vulnerabilities that he was going to keep.
For offensive attacks.
Yes. So he would retain some for NSA, and they would say, all right, well, these are others that we will disclose. In the same process, assumedly, would happen within the other agencies of the U.S. government, but NSA was the biggest. President Obama said, well, no, we're not going to do it that way. It's going to be the White House that's going to decide this. You don't get to decide for yourself. We're going to do an interagency process. Now, it's still a one vulnerability at a time process. Meaning that and so I'm worried that even if we made the right decision every time on the vulnerabilities, you still might end up in a place where you've got this offense-defense balance set incorrectly within the U.S. government.
I would very briefly add to that.
Yeah.
I think, not going to maybe go into detail on how well it's worked, but I mean, just broadly speaking, having an interagency process, or better yet, a whole of government sort of approach to trying to weigh those equities, to us seems a whole lot better than having one particular sort of actor with one particular sort of policy objective taking this on. And I think from what we're seeing in other countries around the world, if we can create a bit of a groundswell and trying to encourage others to put a policy in place, that alone, I think, will help start us down a path that actually is more productive. It's not going to solve the whole problem. Completely agree.
Right, and of course, Dave Attell's criticism is that, okay, the U.S. engages in this head-scratching process of determining whether or not they should disclose or not, but Russia isn't bothered by such a, such a dialogue. So are you putting yourself at a disadvantage if you do implement a policy like this?
Yeah. And a lot of my colleagues, especially the ones that are the most critical, say, well, why should we unilaterally disarm? Why should we give up these vulnerabilities if our... And there is a valid point to that, but if you... is that a higher priority prioritizing that relationship of our capability, our zero-day capability with regards to our adversaries, more important than the relationship of the private sector relying on this software for innovation, to be truer humans, to be connecting at our communities. If we only talk about that in the sense of unilateral disarmament, then we're prioritizing that over this other relationship, which is how we're using these technologies and Microsoft and these other software packages.
So I want to switch for a second here to attribution, because it's such an important issue that is that's still so unresolved. And you talked about, I mean, you did sort of acknowledge the difficulty of classified information, because technical attribution is very limited. Forensic attribution is limited. And you do need that broader view that an intelligence agency or a government can bring in. But you were very adamant about this attribution organization entity would not be government and would not be overseen by government. It would have to be independent. So how effective can an organization doing attribution be without that other view, that global view that an intelligence agency can provide, without the classified information that you're going to need?
Right. Again, great question. My answer is I think that would remain to be seen. The key, and I completely agree, governments have other tools at their disposal. They have other means of collecting intelligence. And so this group would be limited to some of the technical and scientific work that it would depend on in terms of the different sources of be it companies or other researchers wanting to contribute. And so from our perspective, and there's different views on this. As I said, sort of the RAND report seems to indicate that they believe for different reasons governments should not be part of that process. Among others, I think they have a concern that governments might try to sort of undermine both the input and also the output of this organization, and a couple of other things. But it's I think something that as this organization gets stood up, there are different models that we can look to. For example, having a conversation earlier with somebody talked about ICANN and how ICANN got started, and governments really, initially at least, weren't part of this broader governance process, but then created the Government Accountability, Advisory Council, the GAC, and so had of course input on some of those discussions. And I think there are different models for how we can make something like this work. But fundamentally, I think the point is that if we can create a group that is able to bring more transparency based on a whole variety of sources, then that in itself will lead to a process that might instill greater confidence in some of these assessments, and it certainly would instill greater transparency, which in turn would hopefully lead those that are thinking about conducting these sophisticated attacks to reevaluate and maybe reduce some of the impunity that we're seeing today in that space.
Jay, do you want to comment?
And what I love is, first is attribution is one of those areas where we have gotten so much better, right? And it kind of fits in with our comment, with my talk, right? It had been a significant problem for years, and we have just, by patient application of technology, operations, and policy innovations, just been chipping away at it. My model, so I've been talking about this model for this kind of organization for a couple of years, and my model was the Cheonan investigation. So the Cheonan was this South Korean corvette, this Navy ship that blew up suddenly. What year was that? 2010, 2011? And there was an international investigation tied to government that came in, and they found the remains of a North Korean torpedo nearby, and they went through all of this forensic evidence to show why they were confident in their assessment that this was sunk by a North Korean midget sub. And I thought that process of going through, of being clear about the technical evidence, to me was a very compelling kind of model. And so Microsoft isn't picking up this idea out of nothing. We have used this model before. The US government has pushed this model before to help try and help make the case in other places where something bad had happened and the authorship of it wasn't clear.
I just have, I'm going to have a quick follow-up question, but what happens, and then I'll come to your questions. What happens, though, when a government doesn't want to bring the attribution question to an organization like this? You know, you do that if you want to do some kind of visible retaliation, sanctions or something like this. What if you just don't want to even bother with that process, and those organizations that technically agree to the attribution organization just decide to keep one attack for themselves and don't even go through that process?
Right, but I think that raises the question of who are actually sort of the victims that this organization would be looking at and working with, right? And not entirely clear that those need to be governments who might have sustained an attack or an impact from an attack. It could actually start out with looking at attacks on something like a Sony, where you had a private organization affected by an attack, right? And so then, but there's lots of questions. You're absolutely right about how would it work with victims? What if the victim then doesn't want to publicize the findings? And so I think what's absolutely critical is that this is a principled approach where principles and clear sort of rules of engagement, if you will, get put in place on both things like the threshold question, the methodology for the research, the type of experts that would be working on this, maybe a peer review process. There's lots of elements there that I think need to be worked out. But the thing is, today we don't have anything like this, and I think our approach to this has been we have to start somewhere, and we're committed to making this a reality.
Great. We have 2 questions.
My name is Nicholas Ott. I'm with the CCDOE. My question goes to you, Jan. I'd like to know what Microsoft's timeline is. Like, you've been talking about this for quite a while, but when are you actually gonna make a step forward and say we've rallied around support long enough, now we're gonna actually implement this? Could you tell us a little bit more about this? Thanks.
Sure. Do you want to collect a couple, or do you want to just go one by one?
We can collect a couple if you want. We're running out of time. Let me go over here, and I'll come back to you, and then I'll go to you. You have a question here?
Thanks. Henriette Esterhuizen, Association for Progressive Communications and member of the Global Commission, Stability of Cyberspace. Thanks a lot. I mean, since this has come out, it's been really interesting point of discussion. And I think, as Paul said this morning, civil society has really found this useful. But some questions. Firstly, how do you define peacetime in this context? To me, that evokes a very conventional warfare notion of what constitutes peace versus not peace. So I'd like to hear how you see that. Then secondly, do you see all 3 components happening at the same time? Are they linked, or can they exist independently of one another, or not be created sequentially? And then on the agreement part, where do you see this agreement happening, this binding agreement? And how does one keep an agreement like that broad enough to get consensus, but specific enough to actually have any value or any teeth and to be taken seriously? And then on the attribution idea, I think, well, Kim has already asked some questions on that, but just to build on that, can I ask one more?
Well, we do have 2 more people we want to get in.
Okay, then I'll respond actually to the question you asked, Kim. I think it can work really well to have an alternative mechanism that traces attribution. I don't think it can conflict. I think it can provide transparency and perhaps some kind of counter source of information to other government or sources of attribution. So actually, I really like that idea, and I think of the 3, that's the most valuable.
Yeah, good. Quickly, your question, and then I hope I'm not overwhelming you all with these.
No, I'm trying to take notes.
Just one question. To you, Jan, on your last slide, you said that the information leading to attribution when should be made public. Since we know, assume that very often this is based on intelligence by the states against our states. It's not going to be made public. So how do you square that circle?
Right. And then one final question here, and then. Oh, I can't see it in the dark there.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I think we just have to, unless we can go over, we have to. Go ahead.
Thank you. I will be very brief. My name is Dimitri Vogelaar. I work for the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Jan, excuse me if I bore you with this question, because we had this conversation already quite a few times, but How do you mitigate the risk that some actors might interpret a new digital Geneva Convention as a reason to state that the normal rules of the road do not apply? And that's something that we will also try to do, work out in the Tallinn manual, which I might have to admit I've also not read cover to cover. But that's it.
Okay, it's free for all answers now. Go ahead.
Okay, let me try to go through this. So starting with actually the first question, the timeline. Very good point. So as you may have followed, we have been talking about this need for cyber norms for a number of years. I would say that Brad's speech actually was a bit of a sort of inflection point also for us internally. The feedback that we received after that speech, I think, sort of gave not only new impetus but also I think sort of new urgency. And I think there is an understanding growing both inside the company, but I think increasingly also inside our industry, that talking about these things is not just a matter of good corporate social responsibility. You know, we'll gladly take that sort of feedback if people sort of mention that. But I actually think that this goes to part of our core business interests as well. You know, we are rapidly evolving to becoming one of the world's largest cloud computing providers. And when you are in a situation where you are holding many other people's data, I think you have to have a significant interest in a more stable ecosystem. And so there's lots of innovation that we're doing, as we said earlier, on the technical side, but we are convinced that we also need to make progress, and we need to make progress faster on the policy side. So that would be my sort of response to you. I can assure you that with the company leadership now having taken on these issues, in addition to much of the work that has underpinned it, we are moving forward trying to move forward on all three pieces. The question of can they move forward in parallel, or are these dependent? I think we actually have less dependencies on the tech accord side and also this attribution organization on governments, and so it seems to us those are the natural places to really, in many ways, focus a lot of our attention. But that said, we are intent on moving all three pieces forward because we do think we need progress by and among governments, we need progress in the tech sector, and we also certainly need progress on the attribution piece. What else?
We have 2 minutes.
Okay. Attribution question about intelligence being made public. I think that then comes down to who actually contributes the information, right? The input question. Who contributes the sort of the threat intelligence that goes in, that becomes the basis for a finding? And again, our friends from RAND seem to suggest, and I think there's a lot of sort of merit to that at least initially this would be something that would be done and contributed by non-government players, so other industry folks. And so I don't think we're actually in that scenario necessarily facing the same challenges. There might be some, but it might not be the same challenges as much when you sort of work with that group of actors. And then we had a question on binding agreement, how and where could that be done? I think there are entire sessions at the conference on that question, and so I would just, and it also ties to Dimitri's question, and I'll get to that in a second. Ultimately to us, and just to be very clear, we think that this is something that is sequential, that needs to be incremental. There are multiple building blocks to getting to something down the road that could have maybe more teeth or could be codified in a way. I think the work, again, I'll say it again, the work in the GGE and the OSCE confidence building measures and many of these other existing discussions are absolutely critical, and we want them to succeed, and we want to see agreement even on voluntary, sort of politically binding norms, because we think that is a stepping stone to anything that could come beyond that. And the timeline on that, other than the other two pieces, the timeline on these agreements, we all need to be realistic about. This is something that will take 5, 10, maybe 15, 20 years to agree. But if we don't get started now, I think this is exactly where this question of a tipping point actually comes into place. And then very lastly, very briefly, so I think we've tried to clarify what we mean and what we don't mean with this term. I know there are some folks among some groups of countries that have sort of had a bit of a heartburn when it comes to this term of a convention or a treaty. And again, that's not the starting point for us. That is sort of an aspirational goal down the line. I think we've also tried to be very clear, and Brad has been very clear on this. We are in no way trying to propose something that would restrict content or undermine existing protections for sort of universal human rights. And so, of course, terminology is important. But I also would encourage those that have doubts or questions about whether something maybe more binding could be possible to not shy away from that question as a whole. You know, to not the EU, for example, just to name one group of actors, from everything we see and read, and in many ways very admirable, is a normative superpower. You know, let's not shy away from developing those norms and developing agreements that could actually have some teeth. But let's make sure we get those right, and let's not cede that ground to others who might want to use those processes of developing something legally binding for other means. So I would just sort of encourage everyone to have an open mind and try and get this accomplished.
We're going to go rogue. Go ahead, Jay.
Okay, and just closing on the attribution and intelligence piece. You know, the one is, I think the intelligence is most important where it can find a false positive, where other lines of evidence are leading you down to suspect one country is behind this, and the intelligence doesn't confirm that, but it says, no, it wasn't them, it was this other country, a false flag. And to me, that is the most critical role for the classified intelligence. And I don't know how many times that's come up where the intelligence has come in and identified a false positive. And I think we can work around the intelligence as an overall issue if you've got different people that ask questions in different ways. Technologists ask questions in one way, political scientists and public policy folks ask another way, journalists ask a third. I mean, imagine if on this team you had a Kim Zetternell, a Nakashima, David Sang, and the way that they ask questions and approach a problem, right? You can, I think, start working away the problem of classified intelligence in many of these cases. And I did want to pass my thanks to the commission members for being here, for the center, the volunteers, and sponsors. So thanks.
Okay. All right. Let's thank the panelists for their wisdom on all of this. And did you have some?
Mr. Dunn?